Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, we will continue our discussion about normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States. I will be speaking with Dr. Michael Bustamante, Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Moreau Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He is the author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile. Dr. Bustamante, thanks for joining me today. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for the invitation and the generous introduction.
Let me ask you this. During the Obama administration, when he went to Cuba and he began to attempt to normalize through executive order our relations with Cuba, you had a powerful Cuban delegation who were not necessarily in favor of that. But the Obama trip began to see some change in how people thought about normalized relationships. 51% of the Cuban population were in favor of it, were in favor of lifting the embargo. Did the Cuban delegation, which is much more powerful even today, did they miss an opportunity to help really open up Cuba to more liberal economy and perhaps a more democratic form of governance?
In short, yeah, I think they did miss an opportunity, although there's no guarantee for anything or any of this. What you stated is right. I mean, what was really interesting about the Obama moment is that, contrary to the perception that the Cuban American community had long been a domestic political obstacle to trying to move forward to a more sensible approach to U.S. policy toward Cuba, what the Obama administration showed is that presidential leadership matters. And polling results showed that the president's policies, while they certainly had opposition, loud opposition, even especially in Miami, where I am now, he also brought a significant sector of Cuban public opinion with him. So I do think that there was a missed opportunity on the part of Cuban American legislators to shape that process in a more positive direction, rather than sort of stymie it and oppose it from the get-go. But since then, tides have turned. We've gone back to a maximum pressure policy, largely as President Trump defined it, and as the Biden administration has largely continued it. And Cuban American attitudes toward normalization have really pivoted back to being very, very suspicious of those kinds of policies.
The English statesman Edmund Burke once said that a representative owes more than their labor to their constituency. They owe them their wisdom. So let me ask you this. The members of the Cuban delegation, such as Senator Rubio, Senator Cruz, Senator Menendez, have they been leading the folks, or are they simply reacting to where they think the population is because of the next election? Or in the case of the state of Florida, the electoral number of 27 votes to get into the White House?
Yeah, I mean, trying to be sort of dispassionate about this, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. There's not complete alignment between, say, what Senator Menendez thinks and what Senator Rubio thinks. Senator Menendez and Rubio tend to be more in line in their thinking on U.S.-Cuba policy than different, but there have been times when Senator Menendez, as a Democrat, has been a bit more open to some, let's call them humanitarian kinds of exceptions in U.S. sanctions. They certainly speak to significant constituencies that they represent, who have been long time and vocal opponents of normalization efforts with Cuba, who contest the logic that normalization will be an effective policy for bringing about positive change in Cuba. But I think it's also unmistakable that the Cuba policy discussion is very much a prisoner of domestic politics, and it has been used to sort of gin up commentary, I would say a certain fear. It gets connected to the whole conversation of sort of the specter of socialism in U.S. politics writ large. I think we've seen that, especially in the last few elections, where mentions of Cuba are often less about what's actually going on in Cuba, what might be an effective U.S. policy, than they are proxies for some of our domestic culture wars. And on the Republican side, calling Democrats purveyors of socialism. I like to say, and occasionally Bernie Sanders, when he was a candidate, would get himself in hot water in Miami with some things he would say on U.S.-Cuba policy or Cuba generally. But anytime sort of the specter of socialism is invoked to sort of compare Bernie Sanders to the Castros or what have you. I mean, Bernie Sanders' policies are in his sort of best case scenario, he's not proposing at all what the Castros did in Cuba. He's not proposing complete, state control of the means of production, as was long the case in Cuba. So it just the comparison became really, I think, manipulated in many ways. And as I said, there is a real conversation that happens on U.S.-Cuba policy. There's real debate there, but it's absolutely, I think the debate is prisoner of U.S. domestic politics in more ways than it's not.
In your book, Cuban Memory Wars, you talk about a conflicting idea of the history of Cuba since the revolution. Which of those visions or narratives is informing the political establishment of the Cuban population right now?
I mean, there are sort of two baseline narratives. One that sees, and this is sort of the narrative of the Cuban government, first and foremost, that sees the revolution in 1959 as the culmination of all things that came before that and the solution to the country's historic injustices. And then there's the other counterposed narrative that sees the revolution as the turning point, but in a negative direction. And there's all kinds of sort of complexities there that one could unpack. But I think, the political culture in the Cuban diaspora for a long time has largely been in the latter school, right? The notion that the revolution represented a rupture, and a negative one at that, from a Cuba that's often discussed and perceived as idyllic before the revolution, certainly compared to what came after. As a historian, it's quite easy for me to sort of pull that narrative apart a bit, right? Let's remember that the 1950s Cuba had a military dictatorship. Let's remember that military dictatorship had torn apart Cuba's democratic constitution of 1940. Let's remember that even prior to 1952 and that dictatorship, Cuba's democracy was plagued by lots of problems and challenges, to say nothing about the economic inequality in the country, and the asymmetrical relationship with the United States historically. These are all long-term issues that many Cuban Democrats, including small d Democrats, wanted to change. But the idea that somehow the revolution was that no kind of revolution was necessary at all, and that the failures of the revolution perhaps simply make everything that came before it look pretty good by comparison. This is really the dominant way of thinking. And what's been really fascinating over the last few years is that you have newer cohorts of migrants in the Cuban community. Really, immigrants not from the 1960s and 70s are no longer the predominant voices in many respects in the Cuban community. And while that sort of later migrants tended to have different experiences, or perhaps a somewhat more nuanced take on Cuba's history, because of some of the dramatic changes and the crisis in Cuba currently, there's a real sort of repolarization of the narratives that's also happening. Many newer migrants, I see them, are grabbing on to that narrative of very strong opposition that looks back to the pre-revolution's history, or Cuba's history before the revolution, for some kind of model, perhaps, even though that's a history that they never lived, right? So it's a very interesting dynamic to follow, and one that certainly informs kind of the tenor in which the policy conversation is happening.
I was speaking with one of your colleagues, Dr. Jorge Duane, and we were talking about the generational shift, perhaps, in how people think about Cuba. And one of the things that he has said to me was that the younger generation is not necessarily becoming more liberal towards normalization of relations, that in some cases, they're just as conservative. Why is that?
That's the $1 million question. I agree with Dr. Duane's assessment. For a long time, there was this sense that as time passed, as we sort of moved away from the moment of rupture of 1959, as you had second and third generation Cuban Americans coming of age and newer migrants who had different experiences in Cuba, and frankly, more practical connections to family and businesses on the island that would make them more likely to support a more practical U.S. policy to facilitate some of those things. There was a sense that the shift in the community would continue, was almost sort of destined, right? And I think time over the last few years has proven that that's not the case. That really it's the policy leadership narrative, as I was saying before, from Washington, that helps drive opinion in many respects. But in terms of why there are newer generations of migrants or younger Cubans today that are as or more radical or determined in their opposition to the Cuban government as their predecessors, I mean, one has to just look at the context of the last few years. There is the re-intensification of U.S. sanctions under President Trump, which really makes economic life in Cuba difficult. There's also the failure on the part of the Cuban government to follow through on many of its own stated reform items, right? Particularly on the economy from 10 years ago. They've been talking about sort of a certain liberalization of the economy for 10 years. And Raul Castro effectively, when he retired, passed the buck of the most difficult pieces of that reform to his successor. Look at the COVID-19 crisis or the pandemic, which made worse the economic crisis. And I think look in particular between about 2020 and 2021, there was both an uptick of newer forms of civil society activism on the island that culminate, in a sense, in this historic outburst of protests across the island in July 2021. You have, I think, sort of the perfect storm that has led to not just newer Cuban migrants, but Cubans on the ground being much more vocal and frontal in their criticisms of their own government and refusing to accept that U.S. policy is to blame for everything that they're facing. There continues to be a wide range of opinion as to whether U.S. policy is even a factor. You'll hear some Cubans say, the embargo doesn't exist, it's a myth. I would contest that. It is a reality. It obviously has economic effects. And big ones at that. But many Cubans will look at that and say, well, why does that justify the Cuban government not allowing me to protest peacefully on the streets against my government if I so choose? For me, that's an argument in favor of lifting the embargo, because you remove the ability of the Cuban government to actually sort of point to an external actor as the boogeyman here. But I think actors on the ground, Cuban citizens and recent Cuban migrants, are increasingly challenging their own government, regardless of what they think about U.S. policy. And that, I think, is a healthy thing. More and more you find folks who are refusing to sort of accept the binary terms of the Cold War debate and are saying, guess what? It's possible for me to be a critic of U.S. sanctions and to criticize my own government. And we do see that happening too.
But let me ask you this, because on the idea of what negotiation or what relationship we have with Cuba, it's not totally devoid of, let's say, trade. For example,
Right.
Cuba exports or imports a lot of its food.
Yep.
And the United States provides a lot of food to Cuba, particularly the southern states, Louisiana being the biggest state that provides food to Cuba. So there is this notion of relationships, and that's not simply from a humanitarian perspective. That's also a business aspect in terms of American farmers. So there is some of that. And so my question is, why can't it be expanded to other areas? For example, you now have the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act that was proposed by Senator Klobuchar. And I have two questions for you on that. One, how is it possible for that bill to be introduced without a single Cuban representative on the bill, which shows that there was no discussion, which makes no sense? But two, do people truly understand that whatever we may call the embargo, we're the only country, the United States is the only country that has an embargo. The United Nations has condemned the embargo for 30 years in a row. So how do those two things happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think if what you're asking me is how does the embargo exist at the same time that there are exceptions in it, well, you got to go back 60 years and understand that what we often refer to as the embargo is actually a whole sort of mess of laws and regulations that have kind of accumulated over the years, right? Somewhat satirically, but I think it's an okay metaphor. I like to tell people that the embargo is kind of like a piece of cheese. And if different administrations come and go, different Congresses come and go, and they poke holes in that embargo to make it more or less like Swiss cheese. Right? And one of the biggest holes that was poked in the embargo happened in 2000, where there was essentially Congress proposed a law that creates an exception for exports to Cuba that largely pertain to foodstuffs. And so that's where you started to see sort of big agriculture, frankly, become a kind of a constituent for advocating for more open trade with Cuba in general, but certainly taking advantage of that. Now, the conditions for how that trade happens are not normal. none of that trade can happen on credit. There's certain restrictions around it, but it is an important source of foodstuffs for the Cuban economy, and has been. Um, uh, in terms of the new law that has been proposed, I mean, I'm not surprised at all that there's no Cuban American sort of co-signer of that law. There's not really a Cuban American, well, save for the recent election of Maxwell Frost to Congress from the Orlando area, um, who has really been on the record as being a champion of sort of smarter sanctions policies toward Cuba, let alone uh, lifting sanctions generally or creating bigger exemptions. So Senator Klobuchar has been a long time champion of normalization efforts. I think it's to her credit that she's been consistent in that regard. The United States is absolutely alone in this. And one of the frustrating things for me that I often hear from colleagues and members of my own community here in Miami as a Cuban American is, people ask the question, well, why instead of focusing on lifting sanctions, do we not focus on getting more people on board with sanctions, right? Let's make them multilateral. And that I think is just devoid from the history. I just don't think that has any practical chance of succeeding, even if I wanted it to. So for me, there's no contest that the embargo has been a failed policy. The ironic thing is that when you poll Cuban Americans and you ask them, has the embargo worked? Overwhelming majorities say no, because it's obvious, whatever their definition of work is. But when you ask them, should we lift it or should we modify it or what have you, you still get people that say, no, we should strengthen it. And so there's a lot of inconsistency and paradox in terms of Cuban American opinion on this. But certainly I'm not surprised to see Cuban American elected leadership not take a leading role in promoting more trade to Cuba right now. At a moment when, from their perspective, it's not the time to do it if it ever was, given the repressive response of the Cuban government since July 2021. I mean, again, I think that's a false choice. I think the United States needs to move in its interest and in the interest of the Cuban people, and to use the platform of a relationship to try to get some sort of an outcome for those who are unjustly imprisoned, rather than the opposite, which is what we have, which is a kind of a stalemate, which I don't see going anywhere.
As an historian and an academic, where do you fit in terms of whether or not the embargo should be lifted or not?
I'm long on the record as being a critic of the embargo. I would advocate for its complete elimination, and I have. Um, uh, I don't see where it has achieved any kind of good for the Cuban people. And to be frank, you know, I don't think that, well, I'll put it this way. I think there are sort of theories of the case that get made about lifting the embargo that are really ill-informed. I mean, you will sometimes hear people say, well, we lift the embargo, we kind of, flood the Cuban market with American travelers and tourists and goods, and that will sort of just poof, wave a magic wand, and all of Cuba's problems will be solved, and the country will open politically, economically. It's not so simple. I mean, we have decades now of engagement economically and trade relations with countries, with governments like Cuba's, that show that it's not so simply a case. Although you could also argue Cuba is a different case in that this is not China in terms of its sort of relative strength or geopolitical weight. But nonetheless, I do think that lifting sanctions would do good for the Cuban people. I think the policy should be to do no harm, or do as little harm as possible. And right now, our policy does harm, which does not mean that I exempt the Cuban government from its significant quota of responsibility, both for the political situation and for the economic situation. Both of these things work in tandem, right? I think over the long haul, if I can just conclude with this, is that a policy of sort of maximum pressure and blanket sanctions on the Cuban economy as a whole, right? And that's important. These are not sanctions that target only specific individuals or specific entities. These policies tend to disincentivize over the long term the kinds of reforms that we would like to see in Cuba. It doesn't make it a guarantee that they'll happen if you lift it at all, but it's just funny. Critics of the embargo much more often have to make a case as to why lifting the embargo will quote unquote work, when defenders of the embargo never have to make a case as to why keeping it will. And that is a fundamental contradiction in this debate, as I see it.
President Diaz-Canel, his mentor is the former president Raul Castro. And President Castro was open to dialogue with the United States. and to perhaps opening up the economy and opening up the country. There were issues that were on the table that we can get into in a little bit. So, would the current president be open to an Obama like negotiation or discussion, given that he has been mentored by President Castro?
I think so. I think they're desperate for it in in a certain way, right? I mean, they have signaled again and again, both Diaz-Canel, and his surrogates, that the Cuban government's line has been consistent. We are open to a dialogue with the United States on issues of mutual concern, and the possibility of improved relations, so long as there is no interference in Cuban internal affairs. Um, uh, or an attempt to sort of control what Cuba does in its foreign relations, with other countries, for example. Obviously, from the United States, Cuban internal affairs are of interest in this. I think the Cuban government, it's funny, when Obama's policy happened, there were very vocal sectors of the Cuban government who weren't entirely fans of it. If you look at the rhetoric in Cuban state media,
Fidel was not in favor of it. He was very
no, well, he
critical.
certainly was telegraphing that he wasn't. If you believe that he was the sole author behind those columns of his that were appearing at the time, but the rhetoric in state media was really remarkable, especially right after Obama's visit concluded. It was almost like it was too much too soon. And when President Obama spoke to the Cuban people on national television, and both criticized U.S. policy, the embargo, but also called on Cuban government officials to embrace change, it was like a trigger. It was triggering, if I can use that word. And so suddenly it was the Obama policy is more of the same. This is just sort of a Trojan horse through sweet talk rather than, it's the carrot rather than the stick, right? I think, looking back, Cuban government officials should realize that, like it or not, that might be the best thing that you can get from any U.S. president ever, right? And so there's also a certain way in which there were missed opportunities of that moment from the Cuban government's side, as brief as it was. I mean, no one saw what was coming. I think, Washington and Havana were equally surprised by the election of Trump, as was half the world. But in retrospect, from a kind of how do you sort of lock this down and make it a more stable thing that's more difficult to unwind. There were relatively few sort of big signal business deals that were signed during that period, that would have made it sort of, and I think, create deeper constituencies in the United States to resist the attempt to pull it back. The reality was Cuba felt that it had time and it wanted to play it slow because the historical animosity with the United States, and also wanted to play off U.S. interests to get other folks to come to the table. Well, the Americans are coming now, so you Europeans should, invest in us before, the going gets difficult. I think that backfired in many ways. So I think to get back to your question, the Diaz-Canel government would be open to that kind of a negotiation. Whether it's in the cards right now, I don't see it for a couple of reasons. Because right now, Cuba has more political prisoners than it's had in a very, very long time. That is, whether the Cuban government likes it or not, going to be an impediment for any U.S. administration. And the kind of global dynamic that we're seeing in geopolitics, sort of rising global power competition, sort of new Cold War, as it will, between the United States, China, Russia, that has put Cuba in a curious position of, given that the U.S. isn't coming to the table, there are very warming relationships with the Russians in particular, that in the midst of a war in Ukraine certainly is not endearing anyone in Washington to the possibility of a deeper negotiation with Havana right now, even if it might be totally in national interest to do it.
But is there anyone right now who's doing a backdoor channel to the administration of both Cuba and the United States? For example, during the Obama administration, Pope Francis did get involved with some backdoor conversations. Is there anything like that going on now?
If I had that information, I'd be a richer man. I don't. All I can say is that I hope so. I hope so for the sake of the Cuban people. I hope so for the sake of those who are unjustly imprisoned in Cuba. I hope that there may be some sort of quiet conversations happening, but I'll be honest, I'm skeptical. From a kind of a realpolitik point of view, again, one could understand why the Cuban government, in light of the depth of its current economic crisis and the fact that the Biden administration has been so sort of hesitant to kind of throw off the shackles of the Trump policy, why they're turning to Russia and China. But it is also clear that the Russians are using the relationship with Cuba, this growing, warming relationship, to sort of poke the Americans in the eye. And so once again, Cuba finds itself sort of thrust between this great power rivalry. And what's that old expression? When elephants fight in a forest or stomping, right? The grass gets trampled, and Cuba is the grass. It seems to me always in this kind of a scenario. So that's what has me worried.
So let me ask you this then, to piggyback on that. That's a situation that we saw going back to the '60s, turning towards Russia, brought about the whole Cuban Missile Crisis and the like. So, looking at the political representatives of the Cuban community, do they not recognize that United States not talking to Cuba, not looking to normalize relations, does drive Cuba, which is in their backyard, closer to Russia? I mean, is that not an understanding that they have, or does it simply not matter to them?
My sense is that they're keenly aware of the growing relationship with Russia, but they interpret their read on it, or their conclusion from it is different, which is that their conclusion would be, well, we can't trust these guys, right? This is proof positive that these are bad actors that we don't want to deal with, that we shouldn't deal with, because they are in bed with U.S. enemies, right? So it's not a sort of uh, their point of view is not one of realpolitik. Let's try to peel off the Cubans, or at least help them moderate their connections, and moderate the chance that Cuba becomes a national security threat. But it's interesting because I think even within the folds of the Republican Party, and this kind of new consensus, unfortunate and in some ways oddly what's the word, oddly reminiscent as it is of the Cold War. There's I think there is more of a sense of, you do find a strain of thinking that says we've got to do something different with Cuba, because Cuba could become sort of a place for the entry of foreign interests into our economy, or into our region in a bad way. I think simply the local representatives take a different point of view on it, which is that, again, this is proof that these are bad actors, proof that we need to simply clamp down and isolate. I have a different point of view, but that's what their point of view would be.
In the few minutes we have left, if you were with President Biden, understanding that 2024 is coming around, 27 electoral votes are in the balance, how would you advise him about how to approach dealing with Cuba right now?
Well, a couple of things I would say. The Democratic Party, save for a few timid signals lately, they have really telegraphed that they've given up on Florida, right? I mean, there's a lot of talk coming out of the midterms that Florida is no longer a swing state. Look at the DeSantis landslide. I mean, I think that's also responds to the lack of Democratic Party investment in doing the hard work of campaigning in Florida, and among Cuban Americans and other Latino voters in South Florida in particular. I could go on about that. So I actually don't think the Biden administration is really serious about making a play for Florida and for 2024. I don't think it's an essential part of their roadmap. And as such, one could make the argument, well, if it's not such an essential part of your roadmap, why are you still being so timid on U.S.-Cuba policy? The logic, in part, for them being timid before the midterms was precisely, well, we don't want to sort of disturb the Cuban vote, too much, or put that at risk. But at the same time, they weren't really making a serious play for it. So it made no sense. And it was sort of an own goal in many ways. Listen, I would advise that at this juncture, given that Florida is not really in play, although I hope that they would make a play for it, because Lord knows in Miami, in the heart of the Cuban American community, a lot of the bread and butter issues that Democrats care about are of concern to Cuban voters. Out of control housing costs, out of control healthcare costs, you name it. I would advise that they be more decisive on Cuba policy, that at a minimum they follow through on the commitments they made a year ago to begin sort of relaxing some aspects of the policy. They promised, and they've done some of that, but they promised support for the Cuban private sector, for example, and that just hasn't materialized in any kind of concrete way. I would also argue for creating much wider exemptions in U.S. law and regulatory rules for providing humanitarian assistance to Cuba. The U.S. State Department is fond of pointing to the fact that the U.S. embargo has all these kinds of exemptions in it, which is true, but the legalese that one must navigate to understand how these exemptions even work dissuades people from even trying. It dissuades people from even trying to participate in the legal commerce that may be allowed under certain exemptions to the embargo. I would hope that the U.S. government, the Biden administration, would make a serious play with international partners to try to develop a kind of a coalition that says, listen, we'll moderate our sanctions policies, but we want your help to sort of, help resolve the situation with the prisoners from July 2021. Right now, Cuba is sort of like kryptonite in U.S. Politics and foreign policy. No one wants to touch it. I think the White House needs to be less deferential to Congress, where Cuba always sort of gets stuck in this perennial domestic debate. The Cuban people are in the midst of their worst economic crisis, and we need moral leadership. There's a lot of responsibility to go around for that. The Cuban government has a lot of it, but there's more that we can do. And I think we need to lead by example.
My last question to you is this. What would you say to my listeners in terms of what is the present condition of the Cuban population today as a result of the embargo?
Well, again, it's not just the result of the embargo. I mean, this is the very difficult thing about analyzing Cuba. It's very difficult to disentangle the long-term or immediate effects of the embargo from the effects of the way the Cuban government has structured its own economy, right? These things work in tandem. But as I said, Cuba is in the midst of its worst economic crisis. There's tremendous inflation that's happening right now, widespread scarcity for basic goods. I'll personalize it a bit. I recently heard from a friend in Havana. I know someone who's going down to Cuba, and he asked me to, help him get, medicine, and bring it to him, which is not an uncommon thing. But the kinds of things that he's asking for are not some, rare prescription drugs, which I couldn't get access to either here without a prescription. But he's asking for things like Advil, basic over-the-counter allergy medication, just over-the-counter stuff that no one can find, and that in some cases is only available on the black market. The ironic thing is that there is a hole in the embargo for sending those kinds of things. But again, people are so dissuaded from trying to do it in any serious way because of the regulatory mishmash that most of the stuff that happens, it goes in the suitcases of Cuban Americans who go to visit. So the condition is not good. It's a very, very challenging time in Cuba. Look, the last 18 months has seen the highest numbers of Cubans leaving the country since 1959, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the population. That should tell you something, right? Close to 300,000 Cubans, or between 2 and 3% of the population, has left just to the United States alone. The population of Cuba is 11 million. That puts that in perspective. So, the Mariel boat lift of 1980 before this point was the largest sort of single migration crisis in Cuba, 125,000. It's more than double, right? That is a tremendous reflection of how dire things are and how frustrated people are too with the sort of stagnation economically, politically. They're looking for broader horizons and are willing to seek them even when their path to accessing the United States legally is much more restricted than it used to be. That's another important change. So, I think that's the best indicator that there is of how difficult things are right now.
Dr. Bustamante, I want to thank you for joining me today on the Aguilar Conversations. Your insights have been great, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tony.
And thank you for listening today. And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of global interest here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.